What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be going over some running backs in those middle rounds that you should be targeting. With drafts right around the corner, and some of you out there already having drafted, it's going to be extremely important to know which players are going in what stages of the draft, where we should feel comfortable targeting them, and if you break down the draft into three simple sections, the early rounds, middle rounds, and later rounds, we should be making sure that as we enter each new stage of the draft from early to mid and mid to late, we're exiting the previous stage confident in the players that we drafted, while also knowing full well if we are ahead of the curve or behind the curve at certain draft positions. When it comes to running back, a position that's going to be heavily targeted in the early rounds, we should be well aware of how we stand at the running back position as compared to all of our opponents, and having a good grasp on that is going to help us know which players we need to target in the middle rounds at running back. With the depth at running back falling completely off a cliff and no true startability in the later stages, finding value at RB in the middle rounds is going to be very important for several teams drafting. So even if you're somebody who does feel confident that you will leave the early rounds with a strong running back core, you never know what the draft has in store. You don't know if you'll inevitably have to reach on one of these players just to shore up the position, and if that just so happens to be you, at least you can leave the draft feeling confident you paid a price you are comfortable with. In today's video, we'll be going over our top running backs being drafted in the middle rounds. If you think we missed a player, definitely let us know in the comment section below. But before we do get into the video, a quick shout out and a thank you to each one of you guys that have been watching, viewing, and subscribing. We're now just a few weeks away from the start of the season, so a big shout out and thank you to those of you who have followed us along the way. That said, if you guys do enjoy these videos and want to show your support, the best way to do so, hit that like button. We are inching closer and closer to the 100k subscriber goal, so if you're new, maybe you haven't subscribed yet, consider taking today as an opportunity to do that. And if you guys are in a pinch, maybe you don't feel confident in the research you've done so far this offseason, definitely utilize our website. We have a ton of free tools there. In addition to our draft package, of course, which is a phenomenal value, not only will you be getting the positional rankings, but you have individual player breakdown videos, player projections, risk ratings. You can't forget about our sleepers, targets, and busts. Those are all included as well. We've added a ton of information while also simplifying things. Hands down, this is the best package we brought to the table, and we feel confident anybody using our draft package to prepare for their draft will ultimately overall feel much better about their team that they leave with on draft day. With that said, let's hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was who had the longest reception in the NFL last season. The correct answer was Jerry Jeudy. Congratulations to Trip Olgum, the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, at EnchantPizen11. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which quarterback in 2020 lost the most yards from sacks? Once again, that's which quarterback lost the most amount of yards from sack plays in 2020. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's hop right into the video, and as per usual, we'll begin with the player on the thumbnail. Clearly, Trey Sermon of the San Francisco 49ers. Trey Sermon was a third-round draft pick for the San Francisco 49ers in this year's NFL draft. One thing that we do know about San Francisco over the past several seasons, while still very much successful, was overall lacking a singular running back to really make a name for themselves, have an identity in this backfield. The closest thing that they've had has been Raheem Mostert, and while Raheem Mostert has had his moments in San Francisco looking very well himself, we can't use that as an excuse to ignore the red flags like his age. He's 29 years old. 29-year-old running backs don't typically break out in the later stages of their careers. It's not very common, and while Raheem Mostert has looked pretty consistent each time he stepped on the field, suiting up and being healthy and available for the team is something we haven't seen much out of Mostert over the past few seasons as well. Last year, he missed 8 total games. 2 seasons before that, 2018, he only appeared in 9. It was clear that the 49ers do have to continue to look for the longer-term solution at running back. Raheem Mostert, while definitely a player who can fill a role, and while that may also not be giving him enough credit, we do know that they are still always going to be looking forward for that player of the future. So far, all of the options that they've tried to find to fill that role, Jerick McKinnon, Tevin Coleman, 2 experiments that the 49ers got out of free agency, players that they specifically chose for their roster, neither of them worked out. But despite overall lacking some talent at the running back position, this team as a whole has always been a very strong rushing team. This has held true even long before Kyle Shanahan joined the team. The San Francisco 49ers have long been a strong rushing team. A bonus and a motivating factor for anybody looking to target a San Francisco 49er running back, and with all of them coming off the board extremely late, whether you're targeting a player like Mostert, Sermon, or who knows, maybe even later on in the season with Jeff Wilson, to me, those picks are pretty hard to criticize just when you compare the potential upside to the draft cost in order to get them on your roster. Me personally, I stand firmly in the Trey Sermon camp. While his third round draft capital isn't all that high compared to other running backs in this draft like Najee Harris or Travis Etienne, two players brought in by their team specifically drafted with clear roles in mind. Trey Sermon not really going to have that luxury. Unfortunately, that third round draft capital just isn't going to be enough to command an immediate heavy workload. He will of course have to prove himself. In my opinion, though, I think that's where he has a significant advantage. Even if he does ride the bench a bit, the state of the running back position on that roster has always been a bit up and down. Player health, productivity, these are specific areas where San Francisco running backs have struggled to perform consistently. For that reason, I could easily see a pathway for Trey Sermon to carve himself out a role. And as an individual contributor looking at his college resume, it's a very long list. 4 years in Oklahoma. We're talking a player with over 400 total rush attempts, nearly 3,000 total rushing yards, 29 rushing touchdowns. Not to mention, he has a pretty substantial receiving resume as well, even finishing the 2020 season with his highest target market share for that offense. A positive sign typically pointing to player improvement. And with him being versatile, a player that can do it all, the 49ers will have absolutely no excuses when it comes to getting him on the field. As for his size and athleticism, he has pretty prototypical size. He stands 6 feet tall, coming in weighing 215 pounds. And while his athleticism and measurables won't jump off the page at you, his 40-yard dash time a mere 4.66. But historically, what we've seen from many other running backs with a similar athletic profile, so long as they have the burst score, high agility score, we see these every year. Running backs who may not have that breakaway speed, that ability to pop off a 40-yard touchdown like Saquon Barkley, but these players still have short area quickness. They can be effective at evasive runs, breaking tackles. Think James Robinson last season, Josh Jacobs. These are two prime examples of players with very similar athletic profiles. Clearly, a fast 40-yard dash time isn't required at the RB position to succeed. So if anybody out there was potentially avoiding Sermon for the lack of athleticism, I definitely believe that would be a mistake. Looking at some of his strengths heading into the draft, many scouts noted he runs with power. Definitely a player that uses his size to his advantage, but despite having that size, doesn't use that as an excuse to make defenders miss. He's excellent at cutting even while on the move. One of his biggest praises though, definitely his strength in the receiving game, noted as being a natural hands catcher, but don't let that distract you from the fact that he's also an excellent blocker. So if they need him to stay in on pass plays, block for the quarterback, this is something Trey Sermon can do and will likely lead to more opportunities on the field. Overall, to be frank though, Trey Sermon, in order to be successful for fantasy, shouldn't have to do all that much. We've seen pretty inefficient running backs play for San Francisco, post some of their most efficient seasons. I wouldn't be surprised if Trey Sermon does have inflated production over what he would in any other team in the NFL. It's a powerful offense, a creative offense behind Kyle Shanahan. They're coming into this season with more weapons than ever. We have actually had the luxury of seeing Trey Sermon already step in and play in a preseason game. Overall though, it was a bit of a mixed bag. He did start the first week of preseason, ultimately rushing 9 times for 26 yards, so not all that efficient, but it was promising to see him get some usage in the receiving game, finishing the game with 2 receptions. There was a fumble, which can definitely be concerning, but with rookies, a mixed bag is typically what we get. And if you were to ask the coaches on what they expect out of Trey Sermon for this upcoming season, their answer would be to fill the vacated role previously left behind by Tevin Coleman. Coleman, while healthy, was playing on around 40% of the snaps, and if that would in fact hold true, Trey Sermon would be an absolute steal where he's going in the middle stages of drafts. Alright guys, we're moving into the next player. This one you guys will be very much familiar with. It's a player we've been high on throughout this entire offseason. Fortunately for us, the ADP of him hasn't risen at all. The player we're speaking on, of course, Chase Edmonds of the Arizona Cardinals. Since we've mentioned him in other videos throughout this offseason, we won't need to harp on him all that long, but I can give you the updates we've had throughout this preseason. Before we do that though, just to give you a bit of a summary on Chase Edmonds, starting with his ADP, as I had mentioned, it hasn't really risen throughout this offseason, and looking across across all platforms, it's quite consistent, ranging around 60th overall to about 70th overall. That puts him as a high-end running back 3, somewhere in that RB26 to RB32 range. And with him going at that stage of the draft and entering the season with a guaranteed workload on one of the better offenses, and if you ask me, a lot of teams could benefit from drafting him if he brings in that package on draft day. As for him as an individual contributor, last season was where we really got to see the largest sample from him. In that season, he posted career highs when it comes to rush attempts on the ground, receptions, ultimately finishing the season with 97 rushing attempts, converting that into 448 rushing yards, a rate of 4.6 yards per carry. And in the receiving game, very promising work, 67 targets across 16 games. He converted those targets into 53 receptions, so a very strong catch rate. He nearly matched his production in the rushing game when you're talking from a yardage standpoint. 97 rush attempts, 448 rushing yards, compare that to 53 receptions, 402 receiving yards. Believe it or not, his work in the receiving game, when compared to all running backs, actually ranked 5th when we're talking yardage. That was despite running the 13th most snaps at the position, so very efficient on what he did run. But when it comes to overall yards per touch, a metric that translates very well to fantasy, this was an area where Chase Edmonds actually ranked 6th. To us though, this isn't all that surprising. If you've actually watched Chase Edmonds throughout his young career, he's actually only coming into his 4th pro season. There's always been things that we've liked about Chase Edmonds. Unfortunately, he would always be in a backfield that has a lead running back ahead of him. Previously, that role filled by David Johnson. Last season, Kenyon Drake, I don't think we could really say playing a clear role ahead of him, but more of a 1A, 1B type situation. Edmonds not necessarily a player that we could expect to maybe ever get a full workload if we're talking compared to those top elite running backs. We're talking players like Dalvin Cook. Chase Edmonds, a bit on the smaller side, 5'9", slightly undersized. It's typically been a contributing factor as to why this team has opted to avoid him or avoid using him when they get to the red zone or near the goal line. This was an area where Kenyon Drake was featured in, finishing the season last year with 11 touchdowns. But with Kenyon Drake no longer on the roster, does that mean Chase Edmonds could potentially be a top 12 running back for 2021? I'm not completely ruling it out. But guys, we have to be well aware, James Conner, formerly of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a player who is very versatile himself. He can run, he can catch, he has much more of that size. The only thing truly stepping in his way is himself, because the only real knock that we've ever had against James Conner, even back in his days in Pittsburgh, it's always been about his health. James Conner never really being able to play a full season. It's one of the reasons why, despite being a player who, if he does get a full workload, in any given game he can produce like a top 5 running back. Even looking back at his magical 2018 season, when he was the lead running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers, he appeared in 13 games, rushed the ball 215 times, was targeted 71 times, put up over 1,500 yards from scrimmage, scored 13 different times, and that was despite only appearing in a mere 13 games. That's an average of 1 touchdown per game, over 100 scrimmage yards per game as well. James Conner in that season was an absolute stud, but unfortunately for him, has never been able to really remain healthy in any other season since. Had he actually been able to overcome these injury issues, he probably could and still would be the leading running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The spot vacated by Le'Veon Bell, now filled by Najee Harris, easily one of the premier spots at the running back position as a whole. Now, the team that drafted him, Pittsburgh, they let him go in free agency. Arizona, they opted to pick him up, and now he is going to be competing with Chase Edmonds for touches in 2021. Realistically, though, I don't think anybody's expectations for Conner are all that high. Yeah, he could be looked at as a late round flyer, somebody who, if Chase Edmonds gets injured and James Conner somehow by some miracle does remain healthy for a large portion of the season, in that case, I could see him producing like a top 15 running back, but the odds of that actually happening, very slim. But that's not to say that he won't have a key role in this Arizona offense. Right off the bat, we do know that the goal line work and the red zone work is unlikely to go to Chase Edmonds. In fact, so far this preseason, we've already seen situations where Chase Edmonds has specifically been taken out as soon as the team reaches near the goal line. The most recent example even being replaced by Jonathan Ward, which truly does speak volumes, because anybody throwing out the possible narrative that if James Conner is injured and Chase Edmonds is really the only back, then maybe he'd possibly get the goal line in a true featured 3-down work role. But for those of you hopeful, I would keep dreaming, because as soon as I saw Jonathan Ward replace him in that area of the field, that to me told me everything I needed to know. With that being said though, Chase Edmonds and his production, his volume, he does most of his damage in the receiving game. He'll serve as the primary chain mover for the running back position between the 20s as well. This is a high volume role, so to me, I strongly strongly believe Chase Edmonds is in line to once again reach career highs in the area of volume. We're talking rush attempts, receptions, and even if Chase Edmonds isn't used in the red zone all that often, he's still the type of player that can break away big runs. Don't forget, Edmonds already scored 5 times last season, 4 of them through the receiving game. Don't be surprised to once again see a similar type of number from him this season. And considering the fact that you can draft him as basically the RB30, this is a similar type of situation where you're drafting a player at their floor, only potentially leaving room for the upside to hit. Drafting those types of players is a league-winning strategy, so Chase Edmonds, definitely a player I'm looking for in the middle rounds, especially if I'm thin at running back. Alright guys, we're going a bit deeper, but we're still in the middle rounds here. We're in the 8th round. We're moving to AJ Dillon of the Green Bay Packers. AJ Dillon, a player who I featured in our high upside player video, making a case for AJ Dillon to succeed this upcoming season. It's not all that difficult. The only unfortunate part though is that it would partly require an injury to Aaron Jones. But if you guys have actually been following throughout training camp, the latest news that we actually have on Aaron Jones is that he is currently dealing with some sort of soft tissue injury. We'll circle back on that, but just to give you the highlights on AJ Dillon, first of all, he is an absolutely massive running back, somebody similar in stature to Derrick Henry. We're talking 6 feet tall, 247 pounds in solid muscle. Derrick Henry definitely has the height advantage, but if we're talking sheer BMI, I would give the edge to AJ Dillon. All those muscles though, not all for show. He is an athletic freak. His 40-yard dash time pretty respectable, coming in at a 4.53. That in itself, 70th plus percentile. It only gets better from there though, looking at his height adjusted speed score, 97th percentile. His burst score, one of the metrics that I mentioned earlier that translates very well to fantasy production. Once again, 97th percentile. So he's big, he's fast, he's agile, he's basically anything you could possibly ask for from an oversized running back. As you know, the Green Bay Packers did opt to let Jamal Williams go in free agency. Jamal Williams, up to this point throughout his career, has mostly played the change of pace back, the receiving back in clear passing situations, which did initially make it a bit odd for the team to opt to let go of Jamal Williams, keep Aaron Jones. Williams more known for the pass catching, Jones not as much, and with AJ Dillon not being a strong pass catcher himself, Aaron Jones also coming with a significant price tag, I could see a case being made for Jamal Williams and AJ Dillon to be the combination they head into 2021 with. That completely out the window, which means Aaron Jones is likely to play on most of the receiving work, and what that means for AJ Dillon is that he will get most of his volume on the early down work in this backfield. On other offenses, I wouldn't really see it as all that valuable. Without getting those receptions, the floor is very low. For fantasy, if you're starting a player like that, you need them to score typically. This would make him more of a matchup-based flex option at best, at least while Aaron Jones is healthy. I'm not going to completely rule out his talent succeeding though, potentially being a player we could consider starting in maybe some less than positive matchups. Maybe he does work himself into getting more work in the receiving game. We do know that when he was receiving a full workload though, AJ Dillon turned 22 touches into 129 scrimmage yard and 2 rushing touchdowns. So if you can read between the lines, AJ Dillon is going to be one of the most premier handcuffs you could possibly get in drafts, and I know the price tag for him is a bit high, but like I said, he could have some spot start ability. Aaron Jones already being a player that is noted as dealing with an injury, a pretty significant injury history himself as well. I'd say right off the bat, your odds of at least getting a few games this season where you can confidently start AJ Dillon with a full workload, I think you're at least in line for a handful of them. Handful, I mean maybe 2 to 3. That has in fact been the average amount of games that Aaron Jones has missed in each season as a pro. And with the season now being extended to 17 games, I could certainly see situations where they're getting closer to the playoffs where they opt to sit Aaron Jones and rest him, even if maybe he could possibly take the field. The Green Bay Packers, as we know, playoff aspirations are on their mind. Having a healthy Aaron Jones available for the playoffs is going to be a much stronger priority for them rather than winning a Week 17 game. But if something like that were to actually happen, Week 17 is possibly where some of you out there would be playing in the fantasy championship. Alright guys, we're moving into the final player we have in this video, and this one shouldn't be as too much of a surprise either. It's been a player that a lot of people are high on this season, and for good reason. It's Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. The formula for Williams, it's very simple. The Denver Broncos, they moved up in order to get Williams. On top of that, the team has been very vocal about being a bit disappointed at the production they were getting from the position. Tie those two things together, and what you get is Melvin Gordon's role is not secure whatsoever. His loss, though, is the gain of Javonte Williams, who's going to step in and potentially play a 1A or 1B role to Melvin Gordon. This means Javonte Williams could be a player that you draft and initially could start as early as week 1. And while typically you wouldn't be all that excited about running backs splitting carries on a Denver Broncos offense, one that has been near the bottom of the league recently, but with the new addition of Teddy Bridgewater, a quarterback who proved very capable last season, supporting 3 very fantasy relevant wide receivers, DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson, and Curtis Samuel. While those 3 wide receivers are very talented in their own right, if you look at the Denver Broncos talent at the receiver position, Jerry Jeudy, first round talent, definitely expecting big things from him this season. Courtland Sutton, a player who was out with an ACL tear all last season, he's returning this year. And with players like Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler still on the roster, receivers that did step up in their own right when their numbers were called, I think the Denver Broncos receivers are definitely underrated, and that's not even including Noah Fant, a top 8 receiving tight end in the entire league. Those receivers do have the chops to compete with nearly any NFL defense. It is ultimately going to come down to what we can get out of the quarterback position, and I do feel much more confident now that Teddy Bridgewater is on the roster. The Drew Lock experiment, while it's not officially over, what we saw from him last season was a bit disappointing, underwhelming to say the least. I can definitely see Teddy Bridgewater playing up to the tools and the talent of the weapons around him. As mentioned, very talented. And with Melvin Gordon competing for his own job, you would like to think that his production, his efficiency would also increase. And while that would present a risk to Javonte Williams if he does ultimately lose the starting job position, I do think it's very healthy and good for the offense overall to have that type of competition between the two. Certainly a narrative I could see leading to more scoring opportunities. And with their defense being largely underrated in my opinion, I do see them as a team that has the chops to be in very positive game scripts no matter which opponent they're facing. Yet another positive sign for the running backs in this backfield. And Javonte Williams currently is coming off the board outside the top 36 running backs. So if you draft him, you're not going to be forced to start him. You're not going to have to roll the dice week 1 and put him in as your RB2 or flex. This means you'll have the luxury of seeing him develop, knowing that when you start him, you'll be confident in this start. And with the draft selection of Javonte Williams being such a low risk investment at the running back position, he certainly makes one of my favorite targets in the middle rounds. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.